Let me ask you a question. How many of you have a drawer, a box, or perhaps just a neglected corner of your kitchen counter dedicated to mail you haven't opened? It's not the colorful advertisements or the personal letters. It's the others. The envelopes in stark white or manila with windows showing lines of impersonal type, logos of institutions so familiar they become invisible. Bills, statements, notices, documents that speak the cold language of obligation. You see them, you acknowledge their existence with a faint sense of dread, and you make that silent, daily pact with yourself. I'll deal with it later. You are not alone. I was the king of later. And that reign of procrastination, that simple act of deferral, very nearly cost me the foundational dream of adult life. This is not a story about a sudden windfall or a clever investment hack. It is the story of the most catastrophic failure of attention in my life, centered on a single piece of mail I deemed too mundane to open. For years, I operated under a quiet, unexamined assumption. My financial life was, if not perfect, fundamentally under control. I paid my major bills, the mortgage, the car note, the utilities, often on the last possible day, but they were paid. My credit score was an abstraction, a number I glimpsed annually on some free monitoring service, noticing it drifted in a vague, acceptable range. It was background noise. My real life was the foreground, the demanding crescendo of my career, the complex logistics of family, the sheer exhaustion at the end of each day. In that state of perpetual motion, financial admin became the tax I levied on my future self. The unopened mail pile was the physical manifestation of that tax, growing slowly, almost organically. The envelope in question was a masterpiece of anonymity. It was not certified. It bore no urgent red stamps. It was standard white, slightly grubby from its journey, with a typed address label. The return address was a P.O. box for some entity with a generic, forgettable name, perhaps something like Regional Account Services. The logo, if there was one, was a muted, generic crest. It looked precisely like every other piece of bureaucratic correspondence that promised nothing but tedium. It arrived, I am sure, on a day crowded with more pressing concerns. I likely lifted it from the mailbox, scanned it with a practiced, dismissive eye, and placed it on the stack. There, it was buried by the next day's catalogs, the following week's insurance offers, and the month's bank statements. It ceased to be an object. It became part of the landscape, a paper fossil in the sedimentary layers of my avoidance. My understanding of credit was childlike, rooted in simplistic metaphors. I thought of it as a scoreboard, a gentle gauge of reliability. The reality, as I would learn in the most brutal way possible, is that it is a live electrical system, and every entry, every payment, every inquiry, every account is a wire carrying current. A missed payment was a flicker. A collection account was a spark. But I was ignorant of the system's true capacity for escalation. I didn't know that certain documents in those bland envelopes weren't just requests for payment. They were legal instruments ticking quietly in the dark. The collapse, when it came, was absolute, and it arrived dressed in the respectable suit of a lifelong goal. My wife and I, after years of saving and planning, found our dream home. It was the next chapter, the tangible reward for our work. The excitement was palpable. We filled out the mountain of loan application paperwork with a sense of profound adulthood. This was it. The ritual. The process. We submitted everything and awaited the pre-approval letter, already discussing paint colors. The call from our mortgage officer came on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the light in my home office. I remember the confident smile on my face as I answered. His voice, usually so affable, was altered. It was clipped, formal, laced with a discomfort that immediately doused my excitement. "John," he said, using my first name in a way that felt foreboding. "I've got the initial findings back from underwriting. There's a significant problem." My mind raced. Did I miscalculate our debt to income? Was there an error in my employment history? "What is it?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "There's a public record on your credit report," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "A civil judgment. It was entered against you 2 years ago." The room did not spin. It solidified, turning cold and heavy. The word judgment hung in the air. It was a word from courtroom dramas, from news stories about corporations. It was not a word that belonged to me. It felt like a verdict on my character, a final, formal label of irresponsibility stamped on my life's file. What? A judgment? For what? From who? The questions tumbled out, desperate and incoherent. It's for a debt, he said, his tone now one of mild pity. Originally $1,500, plus costs and interest. It's from a county court in a jurisdiction you lived in previously. With this on your record. He paused, and I could hear the soft tap of a keyboard. John, in the eyes of this lender, you are currently unlendable. This stops everything. The phone call ended with a muffled promise to look into options, but the message was final. The dream house, the next chapter, evaporated. In its place was a void of confusion and a rising, hot shame. A $1,500 debt I didn't recognize had just vetoed a decision on a loan hundreds of times its size. The disconnect was paralyzing. How could something so small be so powerful? After hanging up, I sat in the silence of my office, the cheerful sunlight now feeling accusatory, the shame curdled into a specific, chilling dread. My mind, reeling, fixated on a single damning image, the leaning tower of unopened mail in my home office closet. It was no longer just a pile of paper. It was a crime scene. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones, that the genesis of this judgment, this financial life sentence, was hidden somewhere within it. I had to find the ghost. The immediate aftermath of that phone call was a peculiar form of paralysis. The shame was profound, but it was a hollow, wordless feeling. The confusion, however, was sharp and demanding. A judgment? The term itself was a weapon, heavy and final. In the common vernacular, we speak of facing judgment, of something being a matter of judgment. It implies a process, a consideration, a decision made by a reasoning mind. But this was something that had happened to me, in absentia, a legal pronouncement from a shadow tribunal. I felt tried, convicted, and sentenced without ever hearing the charges. My first futile instinct was denial. It had to be an error, a case of mistaken identity. But the mortgage officer had been specific. My name, my old address. The evidence was on a report generated by a vast impersonal credit bureau. The system, in its eyes, was not wrong. I was. To move forward, I had to move backward. I had to excavate. The pile of unopened mail, which had lived for years in a storage bin in my office closet, was no longer a symbol of benign neglect. It was an archive of my failures, a chronological record of every bill, notice, and statement I had deemed unimportant. Hauling the bin into the center of the room felt like an act of profound self-confrontation. The dust on the lid was real. The faint, musty scent of old paper was real. My pounding heart was real. The process was methodical and grim. I created two piles, one for opened, processed items, fewer than I hoped, and a growing, ominous pile for the unopened. I worked by date, starting with the oldest. It was an archaeological dig through my own financial carelessness. Credit card statements with minimum payments missed, then marked with late fees. Promotional offers for loans I didn't need. And then, buried beneath a quarterly retirement statement from 2.5 years prior, I found it. The envelope was exactly as I had vaguely remembered, yet seeing it now in this context made it seem sinister. The generic name, Regional Account Services, now looked like a deliberate cloak. It was not a bill. It was noticeably thicker. With hands that were not quite steady, I used a letter opener to slit the top. The first page was a formal, densely worded document with a heading that struck a physical chill. Summons and complaint. The language was alien, a thicket of whereases, and hereinafter referred to as. But the core message broke through the legalese with terrifying clarity. It stated that a company, acting on behalf of an original creditor, a small, out-of-state medical lab I vaguely recalled from a single test years before, was suing me for an unpaid debt of $1,527.88. My eyes scanned down to the critical instructions. I had a specific number of days, typically 20 or 30 depending on the state, to file a written answer with the court listed at the top. Failure to do so, it stated plainly, could result in a default judgment being entered against me. Beneath the summons was the complaint, laying out the plaintiff's case. And finally, at the back, was a separate smaller notice from the court itself, acknowledging the filing. This was the piece I had missed entirely. It was all here. a complete legal starter kit delivered by the United States Postal Service. This is when I learned the brutal mechanics of a default judgment. It is not a punishment for debt, it is a penalty for silence. The court, upon receiving a lawsuit, provides the defendant, me, with a formal opportunity to respond. When no response is filed within the statutory period, the plaintiff can petition the court for a default. The judge, seeing no argument from the defendant's side, typically grants it. The plaintiff's claims are accepted as true by default. In minutes, a bureaucratic process transforms a disputed debt into a court order. The implications of this transformation are what I had unknowingly invited into my life. A judgment is not merely a negative mark on a credit report. It is a powerful legal instrument. Once entered, the creditor, now a judgment creditor, can employ tools unavailable for ordinary debt. They can seek a writ of garnishment, legally compelling my employer to withhold a portion of my wages and send it directly to the court. They can file a judgment lien against any real property I owned, attaching themselves to the title of my home, ensuring they would be paid from any proceeds if I sold it. They could even attempt to levy certain personal bank accounts. This $1,500 medical bill was no longer a simple debt. It had been mutated into a super debt, armed with the authority of the state. The emotional cascade was violent. Shame was quickly overtaken by a surge of hot, impotent anger. How could they do this? How could a system allow such a disproportionate outcome? I felt targeted, victimized by a faceless corporation and a complicit court. But as I sat on the floor, surrounded by the paper detritus of my negligence, a harder, colder truth settled in. The system had not hunted me. It had not set a trap. It had followed a procedure, a sequence of steps as mechanical as a recipe. The plaintiff had filed a suit. The court had issued notices. I had failed to participate at every single step. The system was a machine, and I had voluntarily walked into its gears by choosing daily not to open an envelope. The mortgage officer's words echoed, "You are currently unlendable." The judgment was the reason, but the cause was my own cultivated ignorance. I had believed that by not engaging with a problem, I could make it disappear. Instead, I had granted it exponential power. I had translated a financial dispute into a legal fact. In that moment, the metaphor shifted. My credit was not a scoreboard. It was a public record, a continuously updated transcript of my reliability. And on that transcript, I now had an F in a class I didn't even know I was taking. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a daunting, focused question. The judgment existed. It was real. It had already cost me a home loan. Was it truly a life sentence, a permanent stain? Or was there somewhere in the complex body of law a provision for a second chance? The anger and shame were exhausting. They were dead-end emotions. The only emotion that offered a path forward was a grim, determined curiosity. I had found the ghost. Now, I had to learn if it could be exorcised. Acceptance is a curious stage. It did not arrive as a peaceful surrender, but as a tactical decision. The anger and shame had burned themselves out, leaving behind a cold, clear-eyed residue. The judgment was a fact. I had created it. Therefore, logically, there might exist a process to uncreate it, or at least to neutralize its power. Resigning myself to a 7-year stain on my credit report, along with the attendant financial paralysis, was no longer an option. The lost house had seen to that. This was no longer about a $1,500 debt. It was about reclaiming agency over my own financial narrative. My first foray into research was overwhelming. Legal terminology, when sought by a layperson in a state of panic, forms an almost impenetrable wall. Vacate a judgment, set aside a default, motion for relief. These phrases swirled in a confusing jumble. I initially sought the counsel of a debt defense attorney. The consultation was brief and dispiriting. For a retainer of several $1,000s, he could likely take care of it. His tone suggested it was a minor nuisance, but the cost felt like another punishment. A stubborn, perhaps foolish part of me rebelled. I had gotten myself into this through ignorance. I needed to understand the path out. If I was to fix this, I needed to know how the machine worked, not just pay someone to pull a lever. The breakthrough came not from a law firm's website, but from the dry, text-heavy pages of my own state's judicial branch resources. Buried in the rules of civil procedure was a specific provision. A defendant could file a motion to vacate a default judgment. The grounds were specific and narrow. The most applicable to my situation fell under the category of excusable neglect and, more critically, lack of proper service. The law, in its intricate fairness, requires that a defendant be properly notified of a lawsuit. This service of process is the bedrock of due process. If you were not served correctly, the judgment entered against you is fundamentally flawed. A spark of genuine hope ignited. I had moved from the address listed on the complaint roughly a year before the lawsuit was filed. The summons had been sent to an old address. I had never been personally served. This was my thread. I began a meticulous, almost obsessive evidence-gathering process. I compiled a folder containing my signed lease agreement for my new apartment, dated well before the lawsuit filing, utility bills and bank statements sent to my new address during the same period, establishing my residence, the U.S. Postal Service change of address confirmation, which I fortunately had a digital record of, a printout of the judgment docket from the county court's online portal showing the default had been entered. This folder became my Bible. It was no longer about the debt. It was about proving a procedural failure. The next step was the most daunting, drafting the legal motion. Using templates from legal aid websites and carefully adapting language from my state's rules, I composed a document that felt foreign in my own hands. It was titled Defendant's Motion to Vacate Default Judgment and Supporting Memorandum. Every sentence was labored over. I stated the facts plainly. I had relocated, had not received the summons, and only discovered the judgment when applying for a mortgage. I cited the relevant court rule. I argued that I had a meritorious defense to the underlying debt. I was prepared to dispute its accuracy and ownership, and that vacating the judgment would allow the case to be heard on its actual merits, not on a technical default. I attached my entire evidence folder as exhibits. Filing the motion was an exercise in confronting institutional intimidation. The county courthouse was a monument to solemnity. The clerk's office was a maze of windows and queues. The staff were not unkind, but they were impersonal, processing paperwork with an efficiency that felt dismissive. Submitting my packet, having it stamped filed, and receiving a hearing date, it was a surreal moment. I had engaged the machine. It had acknowledged me. The 2 weeks leading to the hearing were a masterclass in anxiety. I rehearsed what I might say. I prepared a simple bullet-pointed statement. The night before, I barely slept. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, all polished wood and hushed sounds. My case was one of dozens on the docket. When my name was called, I walked to the defendant's table, my folder my only shield. The plaintiff was not a person, but a lawyer representing the collection firm, appearing via phone on the judge's speaker. This added to the surreal dislocation. The judge, a woman with a penetrating gaze, reviewed the file. She asked the plaintiff's attorney to speak first. He gave a rote recitation. Debt was valid, service was to the last known address, judgment was proper. His tone was bored, expecting a rubber stamp. Then the judge turned to me. Mr. Carter, I've read your motion. You're asking me to set aside a judgment that's been on the books for over a year. Explain. This was the moment. My rehearsed speech vanished. I simply spoke to the core truth. Your Honor, thank you. I am not here today to deny that I may have owed a debt. I am here because I never had the chance to have that conversation. I moved. The summons went to an empty apartment. By the time I learned of this lawsuit, it had already become a judgment that is now preventing me from securing a home loan for my family. I made a serious mistake in not updating my address more thoroughly and in not managing my mail. I own that neglect completely. But I am asking the court for the opportunity to address the original claim fairly on its actual merits, rather than having my financial future determined by a default that resulted from my failure to receive the notice. I paused, holding up my evidence folder. I have documentation here of my move, dated prior to the filing. All I am asking for is the chance to be heard on the substance, not on the procedure. The courtroom was silent. The judge looked down at my motion, then back at me. She asked the plaintiff's attorney if he had any objection to the evidence of the new address. He mumbled about diligent effort, but conceded the documents appeared valid. The judge's next words were the most profound I have ever heard. The court finds the defendant has demonstrated excusable neglect and potential issues regarding proper service. The interest of justice is best served by adjudicating the underlying claim, if necessary, on its merits. The motion to vacate is granted. The default judgment entered on date is hereby vacated and set aside. The matter is reinstated on the active docket. The parties are to proceed to discovery. I managed a "Thank you, Your Honor." The hearing moved on to the next case. I walked out of the courthouse into the bland daylight, my legs unsteady. There was no dramatic celebration. There was a deep seismic shift in understanding. The word judgment had been lifted. The lien, the garnishment, the super debt, they were legally dissolved. I had not erased the original dispute, but I had dismantled the terrifying legal structure that had been built upon it. I had forced the process back to square one, to a place where negotiation, settlement, or even defense was possible. The victory was not in avoiding responsibility, but in reclaiming the right to face it on equitable terms. The ghost, in the eyes of the law, had been unmade. But as I would soon learn, in the digital realm of credit reporting, ghosts have a stubborn habit of lingering. Emerging from the courthouse, the sense of triumph was profound, but it was a clean, legal triumph. The judgment as a binding court order had been dissolved. The tangible threats, the lien, the garnishment, were neutralized. In the eyes of the law, I was no longer a judgment debtor. I carried with me the most critical document of my financial life, a certified copy of the order to vacate judgment, bearing the raised seal of the court and the judge's signature. It felt like a pardon, a physical object that could, I believed, instantly erase the mistake. This belief was my next and perhaps most instructive error. I had successfully navigated a legal labyrinth, but I now had to confront a different beast: the bureaucratic, automated, and deeply entrenched credit reporting system. I operated under the naive assumption that the various parts of the American financial infrastructure communicated with seamless efficiency, that a change in a county court's docket would automatically propagate to the databases of Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. This assumption was dangerously incorrect. Approximately 30 days after the court order, I obtained my official credit reports from all three bureaus, as is my right under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, FCRA. There, under the stark heading of public records, on 2 of the 3 reports, it remained civil judgment. The amount, the date, the county court index number, all of it was still present, unchanged. The vacuum of the courthouse had not created a corresponding vacuum in the digital ledger. The ghost had been evicted from one house but was still squatting, rent-free, in another. The emotional impact was a unique blend of frustration and weary determination. The battle was not over. It had merely changed theaters. Thus began the meticulous, often exasperating process of credit report repair. The Fair Credit Reporting Act provides a mechanism for this, the dispute. But the term dispute is deceptively simple. It is not an argument. It is a formal procedure, and its success hinges on precision and evidence. My first step was to draft dispute letters to each of the 3 credit bureaus reporting the judgment. The letters were not emotional appeals. They were concise, factual, and referenced my rights under the FCRA. Each letter stated clearly, the attached civil judgment has been vacated by the issuing court. This item is inaccurate and should be removed from my credit file. To each, I attached a clear, legible copy of the court order. I sent the letters via certified mail, return receipt requested. This was non-negotiable. I needed a verifiable paper trail, a proof of my engagement that the bureaus could not ignore. The waiting period that followed was a lesson in patience. The bureaus have 30 days, generally, to conduct a reinvestigation of a disputed item upon receipt of a notice. The first responses arrived in bland, standardized envelopes. 2 of the bureaus had updated their reports. The judgment was gone, replaced by a simple statement that the item had been removed. A wave of relief washed over me. But the third bureau, Equifax, sent a different notice. Their investigation, they claimed, had verified that the information was accurate. The judgment would remain. This was the critical juncture where many people, exhausted by the process, might give up. The judgment was vacated. 2 bureaus had corrected it. Wasn't that good enough? But I understood now that good enough was a vulnerability. Any potential lender could use the report from the one bureau that still listed the judgment. My financial profile would be inconsistent, and in the realm of risk assessment, inconsistency is often interpreted as a red flag. I could not accept a partial victory. The FCRA grants consumers the right to an accurate reinvestigation. The Bureau's verification in the face of a court order was by definition flawed. My next letter was more forceful. It was a follow-up dispute and demand for a method of verification. I cited the specific section of the FCRA. I stated that their previous verification was impossible, as the source document, the judgment, no longer legally existed. I included another copy of the court order and a copy of their own inadequate response. I demanded to know the specific method and source of their verification. Again, I sent it certified mail. The second response from Equifax was different. There was no admission of error, but there was a terse notification that, based on the additional information provided, the item had been deleted from my file. The resistance had crumbled under persistent, documented pressure. With the public record removed, the battlefield shifted again. The underlying debt, the original $1,500 medical bill that had sparked the lawsuit, was now just that, an unpaid debt, likely owned by a collection agency. It was a negative mark, but it was no longer a nuclear mark. I contacted the collection firm. The dynamics of the conversation had utterly changed. I was no longer a defaulted defendant. I was a consumer with a vacated judgment, disputing the validity and reporting of an old debt. I negotiated a pay-for-delete agreement, secured in writing before making any payment, whereby they agreed to remove the collection account from my credit reports upon receipt of a settled amount. I paid it. They fulfilled their agreement. The process that followed was one of gradual, systematic rebuilding. I became a student of credit hygiene. I ensured all current accounts were paid impeccably, with balances kept low. I used a secured credit card to generate new, positive payment history. I monitored my reports quarterly. The score, which had plummeted into the poor category, began its slow, stubborn climb. It did not spike. It ascended, point by point, month by month, like a patient convalescence. This phase taught me the most enduring lesson of the entire ordeal. Rebuilding credit is not an event. It is a process of meticulous, ongoing hygiene. It requires the consistent, boring work of checking data, correcting errors, and demonstrating reliable behavior. The dramatic victory in court was necessary, but it was only the first, most visible step. The real work was in the silent, digital aftermath, scrubbing the data, challenging automated systems, and patiently cultivating a new record to overshadow the old. The order to vacate had given me legal standing, but the months of disputes, follow-ups, and careful financial behavior were what ultimately rewrote my narrative in the language that lenders understand. The ghost was not just legally dead. Its echo in every database had finally been silenced. I had cleared the public record, but more importantly, I had begun the long work of rebuilding the private one. I had learned that in our digital age, a financial reputation is a living document, and vigilance is the only pen that matters. If you have followed this journey from its inception, from that initial dismissive glance at a white envelope to the sterile anxiety of a courtroom and the bureaucratic trenches of credit disputes, you understand it was never solely about a number. It was a voyage through a landscape of modern fear, the fear of institutional oblivion, the fear of a mistake made permanent, the fear that a single oversight could metastasize into a lifelong limitation. My $1,500 judgment was merely the vessel. The cargo it carried was a much heavier lesson on agency, resilience, and the architecture of our financial identities. Let us distill the narrative to its foundational truths. The core failure was not financial. It was psychological. It was the ingrained habit of avoidance. We conflate not seeing a problem with its non-existence. We treat financial correspondence as an intrusion rather than a vital status report. My ordeal demonstrated with painful clarity that in the digital ledger of our lives, avoidance is not a strategy. It is a form of self-sabotage that grants the problem a head start of months or years. The first and most profound takeaway is this: confrontation is the most potent financial tool you possess. Opening the envelope, no matter how ominous, immediately transfers power from the unknown back to you. Secondly, this experience redefined my understanding of financial literacy. True literacy is not just about budgeting or investing. It is about understanding the systems that govern economic life. It is about knowing that a judgment is a legal instrument with teeth, that the FCRA grants you specific dispute rights, and that service of process is a constitutional safeguard. This knowledge is not reserved for attorneys. It is civilian intelligence, and it is your right and responsibility to acquire it. Ignorance of the system's rules does not excuse you from their consequences. It merely ensures you will always play at a disadvantage. Ultimately, this journey was about reclaiming what I call financial dignity. Dignity is not the absence of error. It is the manner in which one addresses error. It is the conscious move from being a passive subject of your financial report to becoming its active author. For me, dignity was found in the painstaking assembly of evidence, in the careful drafting of a legal motion, in the respectful but firm follow-up with a credit bureau. It was the decision to engage with the process, however intimidating, with clarity and persistence, rather than succumbing to the helplessness the situation was designed to produce. My story is a single thread in a vast, often hidden tapestry of financial recovery. The specific monster I faced was a default judgment, but the genus is far broader. Your monster might be a medical collection from an insurance labyrinth, a student loan discrepancy buried in a servicer transfer, a fraudulent account opened in your name, or simply a cascade of errors reporting a single late payment multiple times. These are not mere inconveniences. They are data ghosts that haunt your file, silently elevating your interest rates, denying your applications, and constraining your life choices. This pervasive shared struggle is the very reason Credit Comeback Stories exists. On this channel, we operate from a fundamental premise. Perfect credit scores are a fantasy. Real financial life is messy, complex, and fraught with systemic pitfalls. We are not interested in fantasy. We are dedicated to the reality of the comeback. We deconstruct these struggles not with dry theory, but through the visceral, proven strategies of those who have navigated them. We analyze how to strategically negotiate with collectors while preserving your rights. We demystify the dispute process under the FCRA and the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, FDCPA, providing templates and tactics that work. We expose the common reporting errors that artificially depress scores and demonstrate the exact language required to correct them. We move beyond the generic advice to pay your bills on time and delve into the advanced hygiene of credit utilization, aging metrics, and mix of credit. If the story of that one ignored letter has resonated with you, if you felt a knot of recognition in your stomach, if you have a drawer, a digital folder, or a silent worry you've been postponing, then understand this. That feeling is your signal. It is the low battery chirp of your own financial fire alarm. Do not wait for the smell of smoke. Your comeback story does not begin with a large payment or a sudden windfall. It begins with a single, deliberate act of engagement. It begins by obtaining your free annual credit reports at annualcreditreport.com and looking at them, line by line. It begins by opening that envelope. Let this narrative be your catalyst. You do not need to face the complexity alone. Subscribe to Credit Comeback Stories. On this channel, we provide the tools, the insights, and the community of shared experience to equip you for your own journey. We transform the paralyzing unknown into a manageable process. Together, we can examine your unique situation, strategize your response, and script your own narrative of recovery. Turn your shadow from a ghost that haunts you into a guardian that protects you. Because in the end, a well-understood system is no longer a threat. It is a toolkit. And everyone, without exception, deserves the opportunity for a comeback. Click subscribe. Join us. Your next chapter starts with the next video, where we will dismantle the most common credit reporting myth, one that is likely affecting your score right now. I will see you there.